Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. This episode, we have a very special guest, Mr. Tom Moylan, who is a longtime friend and listener of the podcast and has been responsible for hooking up quite a few guests on this series. So you may have heard his name on the podcast before. But Tom is a communication strategist in the Office of the Director General for Communication at the European Commission. And Tom has been working within social media. He's a self-proclaimed social media nerd and is super passionate about the topic. He gets a lot of talks within the European Commission on social media strategy. He's also worked as a political speechwriter, so really a renaissance man of EU digital communication. He lectures regularly on the topic to university students at different European universities, and I know that Tom is a digital strategist who reads his academic literature because he often hits me up for requests to gated articles, which of course I'm happy to oblige those requests. So Tom really knows his stuff. He writes a monthly newsletter that you can subscribe to by going to tommoylan.substack.com or check out a link in the episode description. But in this episode, it's really just a conversation where I wanted to pick Tom's brain about what he's observed very much in his personal capacity as someone who's been working within the European Commission, but wearing various hats from digital strategy to also political speech writing, and getting Tom's reflections on what he's observed over time. Also, what are some differences between those specific modes of communication and also the kind of broader communication plan in terms of what can digital bring to the European institutions and what can the European institutions bring to digital. So there's some things that we just can't discuss, obviously, because they're politically sensitive. But for the most part, these are just going to be Tom's thoughts on trends that he's seeing. We'll talk about the coronavirus response, maybe what lessons can be taken on board from this experience in terms of public institution communication. And overall, a really fun episode. So I hope y'all enjoy it. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Tom Moylan. Again, he is a communication strategist in the Office to the Director General for Communication at the European Commission. Tom, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. Finally, after many years of anticipation and being a huge fan of the show.
Yes, absolutely. And as I mentioned in the introduction, you've worked in various aspects of the Commission and built up a breadth of knowledge on EU digital communication. And before we dive into that in more detail, how did you start working at the Commission and specifically within social media?
Yeah, so I started working in the European Commission in 2014, in fact. So I joined as a stagiaire, as an intern, as part of their Blue Book traineeship. And it was my very first office job. Previous to that, I had been a teacher. So for me, it was a novelty to be working in an office like I had seen in the movies. And I worked in the communication unit of the Directorate General for Development and Cooperation. I think the name has changed to International Partnerships since then, but it's working on development and aid and that sort of thing. And I worked there for a few months. I had my contract extended after the traineeship, and then I took my first social media post after that, which was in economic and financial affairs, which was a super interesting gig, not least because not a huge amount had been done up to that point to develop the presence of DG Economic and Financial Affairs on social media. So it was a really nice process in learning how to build a social media presence from the ground up, and with added interesting aspects like how to communicate a complex topic like that. I think a lot of how I think about social media and how I work on social media has been influenced by that experience, because the idea of having a specialist audience audience to connect with and bringing them value all the time and trying to put myself in their shoes and figure out how to bring them value, but also at the same time balancing it with accessible content and making sure that other people beyond your specialist PhDs in economics and people who think about this stuff full time, but can also get good advantage from what you're putting out. And then from there, I had one of my other very formative experiences in social media where I worked as a kind of a coordinator / strategist / help desk in DG Communication in our headquarters for our offices in member states. So we had about 40 social media specialists based in different offices all over Europe. And arguably, I'd say this is where I learned the most about social media, because I was working with a whole bunch of incredible professionals based in different countries, communicating in different cultural contexts, all with their own kind of specializations. Some of them were a little better at data, some of them were a little better at copy, some of them were a little better at community management. I got to learn from all of these people simultaneously, as well as about their cultural contexts and what, like, okay, Twitter's super popular in Spain and people like to use it like this, but if you check out another country, maybe it's done differently. And I learned an awful lot about adapting to cultural contexts there, as well as having the pleasure of working very closely with our corporate social media team, who manage the Commission's central accounts and also support social media managers all across the Commission. Like, I used to be in ECFIN, so in Economic and Financial Affairs. I will try to correct myself when I slip into our acronyms. So it was a pleasure to work up close with them, because they're people who like have a really professionalized presence, and a lot of what we were doing was kind of drawing experiences from the corporate level and replicating them in member states and vice versa, learning lessons and experimenting with things in local communication and bringing it back. And so I saw so many cool projects and learned an awful lot. And it was, in fact, during this period, I first listened to the Social Media and Politics podcast and wrote you a piece of fan mail, I believe. So I spent a lot of this time thinking a lot about social media. And I mean, besides that, you know yourself, I chronically kind of adopting projects and experimenting with things, teaching in the Commission and in universities, and putting together exchanges or events, guides, reports, all sorts. So, and my newsletter, of course, which is my own personal informal peer review project, where I fire out different thoughts on social media, well, on communications at large, but in the 21st century information environment.
Yeah, definitely. And there'll be a link to that newsletter in the show notes, of course. But here you talk about, these different departments and offices within the EU. I know it's like that in other governments as well, but it's interesting to think about how those offices are sort of organizationally constructed. And I wanted to ask, what was the social media team like when you first arrived at the Commission in 2014? Because I'm thinking about with the incoming Biden administration, there was, floating around on Twitter, the announcement of who the communications team was. And I don't remember communication specialists having such a prominent role or getting so much attention before. So what was the institutional setup in terms of social media like when you arrived at the Commission?
That's a super good question. And to be honest, I was having a think about that before we were coming to chat. And I asked a few colleagues for their views as well. So, I mean, I'm not necessarily the person to talk to about all of this history. There are some people who were there from the very beginning. Notably, there's a colleague of ours called Dana Manescu, who was the champion of social media in the Commission and kind of grew our social media team from a couple of people in a small team to a full unit of social media staff, of community managers, of data analysts, platform specialists and such. But from my perspective, as somebody who's kind of floated around in the juice, so to speak, I kind of conceive of it in 3 periods. So if you think about it, let's say ages, 3 ages of social media. It has a ring to it. So in the first stage, at the dawn of time, and a lot of this is also shaped by my experience in economic and financial affairs and how I experienced going through similar processes and was drawing inspiration from other people. So I was looking at their experiences and trying to replicate it. So we had this kind of first age of social media, which was a lot about internal advocacy and persuading people that it was important and gathering data to support arguments for resource allocation, that sort of stuff. And this was actually a lot of my experience in ECFIN as well. I spent a lot of time trying to show that it could produce value, that social media could produce value, and building trust, convincing people, showing people that if we pushed the boat out a little bit on these platforms, that first of all, there was no threat, but then second of all, it could produce really positive results. Like, for example, showing people you could predict what questions came up in the press room based on what people were talking about on social media. That became a very valuable resource. It was drawing an exact line to the value of social media as a tool. So this kind of period of advocacy was very important for establishing social media in the institutions as something to take seriously. And then we kind of move into the second age, which I am a child of the second age of social media in the institutions. And this is when kind of broader adaptation was taken on. And it was all about kind of building a more professionalized layer, more professionalized structures. You see a lot of that in stepping up the visuals game, for example. That's one of the most apparent. A colleague of mine, Anka Skortariu, who I also worked with in ECFIN, is the head of visual communication and did a great job in making our visuals look beautiful and creative and interesting. But besides that, also you see other things like a stronger focus on community management, to move from broadcasting to a more two-way street of communication. And then you can look at other stuff. You can look at staff skills, like people seriously skilling up. We have a social media network in the commission, and during this period you would see a lot of staff exchanging, sharing information, learning skills from each other, teaching skills. And that was something I saw a lot of from my perspective working with the Commission's representations in member states, in country. We spent a lot of time trying to build up skills and exchange knowledge, exchange best practices, and also filter some of those lessons that the representations were learning on the ground back again. So then that's kind of what I kind of consider the second age. I'm sure I'm leaving loads of stuff out, but this is the things that jumped out at me at the time. And now I guess by a matter of deduction, we're in the third age of social media, and I haven't come up with a neat little narrative to describe this yet. But I can see some trends that are kind of cool that are emerging. Things like staff advocacy is becoming a much bigger thing, like teaching people how to use social media, encouraging people how to use social media. You see more kind of managers, but also kind of personalities getting out there and sharing information and exchanging, like on work issues, but in their personal capacities. And I think that's very interesting. Other things we might see a little more of is using data more effectively. The data available to all communicators has significantly extended, and it influences the decisions we make. Refining and experimenting with how to use that data will be interesting. So I think that these will be features, but I have not, you can't write history until it's history, if you get me. So right now it's just me shooting out predictions.
Absolutely. I'd like to return to some of these current predictions as we talk about the EU communication in the context of the coronavirus. But first, I wanted to ask you about your speechwriting experience. In 2017, you were a speechwriter for the EU's Commissioner for Trade, Cecilia Malmström. And I'm curious to get your take on the comparison between drafting political speeches and political copy for social media, because on the one hand, these are two different modes of communication, but I suppose they can also work together. Or how do you see it?
Yeah. No, for sure. I think it's a super interesting dynamic, and I found it really gratifying, actually, to switch between the two, because my hot line on this, whenever I need to explain to somebody, is that I worked with the newest form of communication, and now I'm working with the oldest. Now I work with both and everything in between. But it's very interesting. I would say that they are somehow not so different when you get to know them both intimately. For example, when I went to my interview to become a speechwriter, I had a limited amount of actual speechwriting experiences, but I had a lot of writing experience. But when I came to my interview, I brought a Facebook post, and I brought a tweet, and I brought a LinkedIn post, and I said, here, look at this tweet. It shows I can write a snappy soundbite, and look at this Facebook post. It shows I can pluck a few heartstrings, and this LinkedIn post shows I can make a logical argument. So there's lots of transferable skills there. And the person who was interviewing me kind of chuckled and said, this is a weird standard interview. You might not get the job, but thank you for an interesting conversation. But then afterwards, they came back to me and they were like, "No, yeah, it's interesting. We'll give you a chance." And that was I very much appreciated that. But they are also, look, they're undoubtedly different. One is the process of trying to get people who are trapped in a room with you for 15 minutes to pay attention to you while you talk. And that involves a lot of like drawing them into a story and also kind of creating an argument that they can follow, keeping them plugged in. Meanwhile, a lot of social media content is about trying to snap someone's attention out of a scrollathon and get them to engage and react with a different type of content, and often not just copy, but audio, visual, whatever you're creating to capture that attention. So they require different approaches. That said, I'm a huge advocate of integrating them, keeping it all part of the same plan. I feel like all of this stuff needs to be created together. And you can think about it in two directions. You can think about, for example, one of the things we'd often do is think about how a speech can go beyond a room. So you include lines with the knowledge that they will be tweeted. You include imagery with the knowledge that it will take to social media well. But also, you can clip like little videos of the speech, tweets, photos, key messages, make blogs and Facebook posts and LinkedIn posts based on them, anything to amplify the impact of a speech. So social media is there as an amplifier. But it also goes the other direction too. I remember writing a speech at one point where I needed inspiration, right? So what I did was I tweeted out a tweet saying, "Hey, hashtag trade Twitter. What do people believe to be true about trade that when in fact the opposite is true?" And this community of trade experts who I had been connecting with over several years all came back with these incredible answers. And these answers ended up inspiring me to write a speech in a particular structure and in a particular way. And then we fleshed it out and developed it, of course. But what was super interesting was, in fact, the people who were in the room when the speech was delivered ultimately were probably some of the people who were contributing to it in the beginning. And so coming full circle. So like it's, and often speech writing I found is about finding that space between what you want to say and what they want to hear. So I don't think of them as separate experiences. I think of them as really all malleable and squishy and blurry and all part of each other. And that's one of the things that I very much like about communications at large, is because you get into so many different areas that require different sets of eyes and different opinions and different approaches. But ultimately being able to draw them all together will benefit every single part of it, if you get me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about sourcing content for political speeches using social media. It's quite interesting.
Oh, yeah, but that's exactly what I was talking about as well. When you say that, like, for example, scanning community management or scanning conversations online to see what might come up in the press room, for example, or like looking at how different topics are talked about to get a better understanding of what people believe about them. Because it's, at the end of the day, it's the same as going out and having a conversation with anybody, right? Social media, it's a two-way street. We're there to learn from people on it too, right? If you're not drawing inspiration from your community, you're only using half of the capacity, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about exactly what you're talking about with, you mentioned sound bites on Twitter and sort of amplifying speeches beyond the room, because one of the kind of staples of political communication since, the radio days is the sound bite, and then there's been the image bite for television. And I was wondering if you've noticed that EU politicians have been maybe changing their formal communication in a way that might be thought of as a social media bite.
Yeah, I mean, the soundbite, this is the thing. The soundbite, like you were saying, it's been a thing for a long time. But certainly social media is more kind of part of people's thinking these days. I think that you see a little more of social media first thinking, but I'd say that it would depend on the topic that you're dealing with, right? So you always have to think in any part of communications who the audience is. And it's not always, I just have this experience from economic and financial affairs, for example. Like, not every economic report that we produce is going to go viral. So you're not necessarily going for putting together a social media bite on that. But then what are you trying to do on social media instead? You're trying to produce content that makes this stuff more accessible to the audiences that will be using it anyway. You're trying to get the key content, the key graphs, the key concepts across so that people can immediately be like, oh, I do find this interesting and relevant to my work. However, when it comes to politicians, perhaps it's slightly different, like, because they might want to capture attention with a particular line that they know will land well, or a particular piece of content that they know will land well on social media. And we see a lot of that. And it's interesting because it does depend topic by topic. Like, I've noticed too that there are topics that go down better and are better deployed on social media for whatever reason. For example, LGBTQI issues tend to take off better on social media than other types of messages. And perhaps one of the reasons for that is that it's a group that doesn't necessarily get represented in the traditional media as such. And so it's all part of this kind of the different types of gatekeepers, right? Different voices being added to the mix by social media. That's one of the great positives of social media, is you get these unmediated new voices being introduced to the situation. And because you don't have that kind of traditional media gatekeeper, and you have a different kind of set of audiences that deal with things in different ways on social media. And I think that's, whenever I think about the social media bite, I'm thinking about the stuff that will land there, not just the format, not just the form and the witty line or the snappy tweet or the interesting clip, but also the topic. Who is there? Who is this landing with? Why is it going to land on social media differently than on other platforms?
Yeah, and it makes me think, you kind of touched on it, but this difference between communicating as an individual versus as an institution. So on the one hand, you need to keep the audience in mind, but then also when you're kind of crafting that copy or that narrative, I'd imagine it's in some sense easier to do as an individual politician rather than a sort of large supranational government institution. So I wanted to ask, what are some of the challenges in communicating as an EU institution? Can they adopt a similar line of strategy as an individual politician, for example?
No, I wish. Yeah, but no, it's a super good question, and it's actually, it's so the challenges. I could list the challenges all day long, but at the core, as I see it, one of the biggest challenges is kind of surrounding the role of the EU institutions, because essentially we're up to two things on social media. On the one hand, we have to explain what we can do and why we're doing it, what role are we fulfilling, and then we have to show the impact, and we have to show why we're fulfilling this role and why it's a good idea. And I think that's one of the big challenges, is taking on this dual pedagogical and impact focused line, because, well, at the end of the day, we're also we're performing a public service overall, right? We're not out there to promote ourselves, or we're not out there to do it for fun. If we wanted to have the world's most popular Twitter account, we'd just tweet, cat videos and memes all day. But no, we're there to perform a public service. So we need to kind of explain our role, explain what we're doing as a public service, and then also show the impact and the value of that service at the same time. And I think that combo is a very full plate for a social media presence to deliver, especially when, like, the format is not always well suited for, lengthy discussions of institutional nuance. Like, that's also one of the challenges as well, is a lot of people, when they're thinking about the institutions, they tend to draw comparisons with national governments because that's what they know. And it's a different thing entirely. And that's also why I like it and why I like working for the institutions. I find it very interesting because it's an entirely different sort of project, but conveying that is not always easy, and admittedly we don't always make it easy for ourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, you take all those challenges and you compound them by the changing platform environment that I think back when you started, it was Facebook and Twitter reigned supreme, and Instagram was just a blip on the radar. But now Instagram is a huge player. We have TikTok popping out of nowhere, and now we have more audio focused apps like Clubhouse and Speaker. And so, I'm just curious to get your take on these platform differences when communicating as an institution, because I'd imagine that it's slow to respond to these changes. So how do you see those different platforms and how the commission can sort of keep up with that environment?
Yeah, I do not think this is a unique problem for the Commission. Everybody who is on social media has the same kind of challenges in this sense, keeping up with a fast shifting environment where not only are there new platforms coming up, but the platforms that you're already on are changing the game as you're posting on them. I kind of see, like, among my not just within the EU institutions, but within the broader communications environment, I see there's kind of two broad schools of thought. One of them, we should be everywhere. The other one, we should be more focused. And I'm somewhat of the second school, of the focus school, but I have a huge amount of sympathy for the first. And I see the strong argument for just needing to occupy space, because if you're not out there occupying space, what are you doing? Your messages are missing an audience. That said, there's a meme I saw recently which made me laugh, which was a bunch of people sitting in a boardroom saying they don't like our message on TikTok. Maybe they'll like it on Clubhouse. And I'm more of an advocate of like following a platform and making sure it's done right. And I think that's certainly one of the approaches that I have observed in the institutions. And it's one of the things that the social media and the institutions have followed. Because you have to bear in mind that each new platform joined as a corporate entity is a major commitment, because you have to do research, you have to get resources, it needs to be justified, especially if you're working for the public. And I can see the value in some of these things for bigger institutions like Facebook providing incredible reach. Everyone's on Facebook, that's why it's so obviously justified. Twitter providing fast information and access to experts and journalists, though I know the demographics of the platform are changing, but it's obviously important for addressing one of the kind of key changes in the information environment, which is this kind of move away from deadline media to 24-hour content creation. So that's has obvious justification as well. Instagram, LinkedIn, you can see a lot of these kind of unique opportunities in these, but then you see other things and other types of platform emerge, and maybe it's not entirely clear where the value is immediately, and you have to see how it develops. You have to see the audience that develops there, the type of interactions they're having, where you fit into the puzzle, always thinking about your role. But I think there's other solutions to this which are perhaps a little less institutional, but one is obviously staff advocacy, which I think is, as I was saying, is an increasing trend. You see more staff on social media, and there's nothing that's to stop us going out and discussing the EU as individuals. There's more flexibility, in fact, less expectation. You can go on, like if Tom Moylan jumps on Clubhouse and uses it once and kind of then decides it's not for him and disappears, it's a lot less of a major enterprise than if the commission decides to build a strategy and join Clubhouse and then decide and then doesn't post, and everyone's like, what's going on here? In fact, on Clubhouse, I've seen lots of people. I've seen directors general, heads of unit, people working on all sorts of stuff from inside the commission and from all over the place having debates on Clubhouse, which is pretty cool. I also saw an assistant to a member of European Parliament who has a Twitch stream where they chat about EU issues and play video games. So I feel like this kind of more individual approach also complements the conversation and enriches the kind of broader EU conversation. I haven't seen an EU TikTok yet, but I'm looking forward to the Ode to Joy challenge.
Yeah, it reminds me, this staff advocacy is interesting. It seems that we've seen that, in a sense, play out already in the media sphere, where journalists will publish their articles, but then they go even further on Twitter, providing context around it. Or I've also seen this in terms of White House communications, where there's the official White House communication or communication for a political campaign, but then you have this whole buzz of activity around the individual staffers who are out there providing more context and meta commentary on that communication, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I remember I listened to an interview with it's Stefan Smith, isn't it? Who worked for Pete Buttigieg, and I remember him saying that they were really they had a really personality driven approach where it was accepted that people within their campaigns would build their own followings and then use those to kind of leverage and springboard. And I think that's a super nice and interesting approach. That's something that I like a lot in an institutional environment as well. And I think we are moving that direction. And I think it's a super useful tool for humanizing a big monster institution like us, right? Because you get to see the people who are working there, and they're not kind of mysterious people, but they're actually kind of thoughtful, hardworking people who believe in the project and are out there engaging and really trying to explain. And I think that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and this idea of humanizing institutions, I think, is really important. And that's something that social media really offers, is the opportunity to do that. And so I wanted to kind of transition into recent events around the coronavirus, where obviously showing compassion and caring has been I would assume a priority for government institutions around the world. And so I'm wondering, how has the commission navigated dealing with the coronavirus response and all the kind of uncertainty around it? I mean, I'm sure that's a difficult situation, but are there lessons you think that will maybe stick with the commission moving forward because of this massive event?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to come out of this unchanged, We're all humans. Look, these are a few of my own kind of observations on this, but I can see that there are a few things that make this crisis different to any other crisis before, because you can look at a crisis before, but it's clear that there are implications from such a major kind of all-encompassing crisis for all humans, but also for communicators. As humans, communicators feel these implications too. So, I mean, okay, look, off the bat, I mentioned all-encompassing, direct impact. Like everybody in Europe has felt this, right? Like everyone around the world is feeling this. And I think that the implication from that is that people want to see, they don't want to hear about intention and they don't want to hear explanation so much, but they want to see direct impact and feel emotional connection, like you were saying. So there's a need to focus on the impact in day-to-day life. And again, this is just a good practice in communication at large. This is not rocket science, but it's obviously absolutely vital in this context. So acknowledging that people want to see impact, telling them about the impact, showing stories, like illustrating it with stories with real human beings that they can connect with, acknowledging that kind of emotional element. And as much as possible, show, for example. Like a crisis is an incredibly visual and visceral experience, right? So people want to see supplies being landed. They want to see people being helped. And I think that's a good principle to bounce off of. And another thing that makes the crisis different is that people are feeling genuine fear and seeing real threats to people that they care about. And indeed, again, this means that we need to connect to them with emotion. Things like testimonials, sharing people's stories on vaccination, that sort of thing. But also engaging on social media in community management, actually talking to people. Again, we're coming back to social media as a two-way street. It's our opportunity as an institution to talk this out with people. And it's not just about talking it out with an individual, but if you talk it out with one person, a silent majority will see that conversation. So it has wider effects when you engage with people and acknowledge their emotion and talk it out with them. There's also, we were talking about the uncertainty of the environment, and indeed the dynamics of the situation are unique as well. The data is always changing. Instructions are always changing. Guidelines are changing. So there's kind of two challenges in that context. So communicating uncertainty and communicating in an uncertain environment. And there's a load of things that, I mean, in the institutions, we've done a bunch of stuff around setting up a web page to provide a central point for reliable information and data, for example, and consistently updating it, like sharing what we know and what we're doing, and kind of both on this website, but also on social media, giving people a place that they can rely on for stable information. I think there's a really nice example that the corporate social media team and the commission have been doing. They've been doing these Instagram chats with experts answering different questions on the crisis. So kind of like getting in an expert on virus variants to have a chat about that, getting in people who have been working on vaccination to talk about how it works and why it's safe and why it's a good idea. So that's really nice, and having that human point, that human being to look at, I think in this environment makes a huge amount of difference. And then besides all of this, you have like the fact that the source of the crisis is unique in itself. It's not political as such, but the management has become very political, and increasingly so as the crisis has gone on. So we need to be present in that conversation, not least to avoid being scapegoated, for example. So a lot of navigating that has involved focusing on what the Commission's role actually is in the crisis, economically, socially, in terms of coordination or facilitating. So I think that like showing the problems we can solve and how we're solving them, it comes back to that as well. As a footnote, this is not necessarily Commission related, but another interesting dynamic which came up in a conversation I was having with some students a little farther back in the crisis is that this is a global crisis playing out on social media in real time. And it's kind of a collective experience where we are all kind of commenting, memeing, sharing experiences, sharing mis and disinformation, but going through it together. I suppose that's something that you and your colleagues and kin will be studying for a very long time, right?
Yes, usually with some time lag, which brings me to my last question, which is kind of a two-parter about, I could just imagine, again, not an EU-specific problem, but there's been so much communication the past year about the coronavirus. And hopefully as things start easing out of this pandemic, there's a sort of path forward, right? So when transitioning out of a crisis scenario and sort of getting back to quote unquote business as usual, I mean, how do you see the Commission making that transition into a more stable communication strategy, and sort of where might that be heading in the future? Where would you like to see that head in the future?
Oh, yeah.
In terms of trends and things like that,
No, for sure. I mean, so whenever I've thought about coronavirus and its impact on kind of the communication environment so far, actually, to be honest, in terms of everything, you can always think of it in terms of acceleration, because pressure and crisis causes people to adapt, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of the trends that we see people adapting to they're not new. Take remote working being the really obvious one. It was already on the way in. But now, obviously, it's been accelerated. The same for big data, for example. The idea of using big data to try and solve societal problems. Obviously, much more accelerated and kind of brought into the mainstream. I also think green issues. This is slightly me just observing again. But I think a big communal experience where we're all bent to nature makes people kind of engage with that reality of a little more. The reality of climate change and the reality of kind of environmental degradation. So you see all of these things being sped up everywhere, and you look at public or political comms and you see similar accelerations, things that were already happening but now increasingly so. So for example, I'm going to talk from the perspective mostly of public comms. So you see a lot of kind of traditional cautious organizations now adopting new styles of communication, informality, emotionality, more kind of community-oriented conversations, like community engagement as well. And with that, engaging with new voices as part of that community. You also see faster information environments that are not necessarily suited to rigid structures. So you see a lot of institutions and politicians learning these new rhythms, adapting to these new rhythms, sometimes changing the structures of how they work, having shorter planning and reaction time horizons. And besides that, you also see kind of a broader demand for new skills and tools. So, for example, as everybody is trapped at home, everyone's like, oh God, we all need to kind of communicate digitally better. So you need to get out on social media and get into where people are actually having conversations. So you see kind of a lot more, I don't know, this is just my perception from operating in the environment, but I see a lot more social media teams being built, a lot more remote communication teams being built. I've also noticed, again, might be in my imagination, but I see a lot less advertisement for things like social media manager, which is in fact, 20 different jobs rolled into one. But you see more people talking about data analytics, multimedia producers, visual designers, community managers, copywriters. I think that's indicative, is that we kind of separate these things out and realize how, as the mode of communication becomes more important, you'll see people paying more attention to the nuance within it. Though, at least that's something I hope, but that's just me as a social media nerd praying.
Yeah, it's something that, as you mentioned before, in terms of studying these things, in a sense.
As someone who studies it, if you don't mind, I'm just going to shoot a couple questions back. But as someone who's studying it, do you see any kind of or someone who observes it and thinks about it themselves, what do you think is going to come out of the coronavirus crisis for political and institutional communicators?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm still stuck on the 2020 election in terms of what I'm looking at the moment. But what I was going to say is that it's interesting to hear kind of how these things are, these challenges really that are emerging. And as you said, we're seeing the job descriptions change towards more specialized roles, which is sort of a long time coming, which is now accelerated. And so I think when studying these things, it's important to keep that in mind, that these teams are becoming more professionalized, but then they're also dealing with this massive uncertainty in the coronavirus. And so on the one hand, I guess one thing to look at is there more experimentation or is there more falling back on guidelines? Because some institutions are quite risk averse, or most institutions are risk averse. So I think that's something to see, because if it was the European Parliament, then we might say it has more room to try new things because it has this more public mandate, whereas the Commission, I would expect to fall back on sort of rigid guidelines and be slow to change. So that's one thing you could try to look at is how much experimentation actually happens when the stakes are high. Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question to ask. I have to give a shout out to our social media team, who I see doing some really cool stuff throughout the crisis. I mentioned the lives, but also in terms of visuals and in terms of community management, some of the stuff they've been up to is really interesting. But that exactly, this is the live exchange focus, right? We see more of that than ever. And we also see, and again, I guess it's linked to the staff advocacy thing, but another thing I've noticed about these lives is that for the first time, you're also seeing kind of members of the social media team interviewing politicians, interviewing experts. And it's not like the European Commission is interviewing this person. It's Barbara from the social media team who's asking questions. And I find that that's interesting in terms of kind of the staff advocacy perspective, but also it's pushing the boat out, let's say. Yeah, I guess it's in a sense, it's kind of a way to offload a bit of experimenting risk, right? By putting it with the staff rather than the institution. Yeah, but it's via institutional accounts is the thing. But it's just, I hadn't thought about it until we started talking now. But no, it's interesting. But I would say just from where I'm sitting, I see a little more experimentation. I don't think anybody in a crisis, nobody wants to throw the rule book out the door, and kind of wing it. That's the last thing anybody needs, because in a crisis, you need to provide a bit of kind of consistency and professionality. That's what people expect. It's what people want. But it's a moment to rethink the way we work anyway. Definitely. I think this is a good time period for that, as we're sort of on the tail end of this pandemic. So we have some idea about what's happening, but also there's still a bit of uncertainty about the future. And so it's really cool to finally have you on, Tom, and come and share some of your insights with us. So thanks for taking the time out. My pleasure, Michael. Thank you very much for having me. I've just been speaking with Tom Moylan, communication strategist in the Office to the Director General for Communication at the European Commission. don't forget to check out his newsletter at tommoylan.substack.com. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see what's coming up on the podcast. As you listen to this, we're having the International Communication Association conference, virtually, of course, but I'm hoping to scout out some cool research that's going on in social media to highlight on the show. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.